So the first thing to note in the first three lines of Ozymandias is how distant the speaker is from Ozymandias himself. Now, I is the speaker. So every single time in a poem when you see I, that is the speaker of the poem. This may or may not be the poet himself. So we don't know whether this is Shelley who's the I or if it's just a persona of Shelley's, but what we do know is that there is a speaker who is essentially narrating the entire poem. But it isn't the speaker who actually tells the story of Ozymandias. The speaker just meets someone else who tells the story of Ozymandias, and that someone else is the traveller. So it's the traveller who actually witnesses Ozymandias' statue. And just to remind you guys, it's not Ozymandias himself that this traveller witnesses, it's Ozymandias' statue or monument or whatever you want to call it, the artwork, the vast and trunkless legs of stone that he has left behind. Ozymandias, of course, is long dead. So if you want to look at it this way, maybe I'll write it out so that it's a lot clearer, because it is a complicated topic. But there is the I, who is the speaker, who meets a traveller who sees Ozymandias' statue with his own two eyes, which is left behind by Ozymandias himself, who is long dead. So, in actuality, the I, the speaker who is narrating the story, the poem, isn't actually the one to see Ozymandias' statue, isn't the one to see Ozymandias' legacy. It's actually, there's a medium in the middle who is this traveller who actually gets to see the statue and who gets to kind of see all of Ozymandias' artwork and legacy. So first of all, there is this distance between Ozymandias and the I, the speaker, and that's illustrated through the traveller who kind of comes between. And this traveller isn't even mentioned. It's just a traveller. It's this kind of random, I guess you could say, insertion who acts as, like I said, a medium. And medium is just like a middle ground to introduce the subject to the poem, I guess, or to the speaker. And that subject is, of course, Ozymandias' statue. So yeah, so there's this distance, and I think that is really illustrated through the language, I guess. I met a traveller. Again, met is in the past, so this hasn't happened now. It happened a while back, hence we've got the past tense. So we get the sense that the speaker is narrating a story from maybe some time ago, and this is also kind of emphasised by the word antique. Antique being, of course, an adjective to describe the land. So again, we've got this idea of the past, of distance, of something that's not really tangible, present. It's from a while back. And this, of course, is reinforced throughout the whole poem, that Ozymandias is a thing of the past. He's not really relevant anymore. Things that belong to the past are antique and old and aren't very well known. And this, I guess, is really stressed by the fact that the speaker himself doesn't really see Ozymandias himself or Ozymandias' statue himself. It's done through a few steps. It takes us a while to actually get to Ozymandias himself, who is long dead. We have to pass through many mediums or time periods, you could say, in order to get to Ozymandias. He's almost irrelevant. He doesn't really seem to matter anymore, and it takes a lot of effort for us to get to Ozymandias' statue or Ozymandias himself, if that makes sense. So this traveller is the one who is essentially narrating the story or the poem, I guess, the story in the poem. And the traveller says, or said, again we've got this past tense, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. So this story is from the past, but the traveller is narrating it as if it's happening now. We've got this juxtaposition between the adjective vast and the adjective trunkless. And these two juxtapose each other because you've got the connotations of the word vast, which imply that something is huge and intimidating, and then you've got the connotations of the word trunkless, which imply that something is missing, a trunk is missing, the body is actually missing, which makes it seem smaller than it actually should be. The actual kind of the trunk of it, trunk is the middle part, is missing, it's gone, and it really stresses, you've got the stress on less. It's missing, it's not there anymore. What really is important isn't there anymore, and all that's left is just legs of stone, right? We've got all that's left is just his head is left, his actual trunk is gone. So what's really important, the body of the monument is missing. So this juxtaposition, I think, is really important, because at first something seems vast, but actually the substance is missing. And it stands in the desert. So again, the word desert, I think, really links up with the word antique and even land, I guess. So the noun desert is important because it really links with the adjective antique, I would say. You've got this antique desert, you've got this foreign land, you've got this kind of far away and very distant stretch of desert, which, as you can remember, Shelley's reader, who would have been British, probably, has never really seen. So again, distant, idea of something distant or exotic almost, which the reader can't really identify with. The reader can only imagine, but most likely the reader has probably never even been to a desert. So yeah, I think from the first few lines you can see that Shelley is really kind of introducing concepts through language, and language is always really important because it introduces themes and concepts which go on throughout the whole poem. So already we've got a semantic field of distance, we've got a semantic field of antiquity, old. I just want to point something out that really popped up to me in the first 3 lines of this poem, and that is, if you've watched our socio-historic context, form and structure video, you'll probably be acquainted with the idea that names equal power. Back in Shelley's time, a name was very, very important, and it meant power, identity, and all that jazz. Essentially, your name held a lot of importance. And later on in the poem, Ozymandias himself says, "I am Ozymandias, King of Kings." If you've watched the socio-historic context video, you'll know that we talk about the Tower of Babel. So essentially, one name meant power, one identity meant power. But also, just in general, the idea of names holding a lot of power stands, and still to this day, a name equals power, equals class, equals hierarchy. Now, what's interesting about these first few lines is how there's a distinct lack of names, right? So we've got the I, who's the subject of the poem. He doesn't have a name, or she doesn't have a name. It could well be Shelley, but that's not set in stone. This could also be someone random. It could be a persona. It could be anyone, really, but there's no name. It's just a personal pronoun. More importantly, the actual, I guess you could call them a narrator, the actual narrator of the poem, the medium between Ozymandias and us knowing about Ozymandias, is this random traveller. And this random traveller doesn't have a name. In fact, this traveller is only mentioned once in the poem, but this traveller is so important to the poem. This traveller is the reason why we even know about Ozymandias, the reason why, I guess, the reader knows about Ozymandias, because the subject meets a traveller who is the medium, who is the in-between, and that's how we're introduced to Ozymandias himself and Ozymandias's legacy. That's how we kind of know about Ozymandias's monument. And this is interesting because this medium doesn't have a name. Shelley purposefully doesn't give the traveller a name. It's just a traveller in which the article, and that's what we call a, it's known as an article. The article a symbolizes anonymity, and anonymity basically means lack of identity. And this lack of identity is also shown through the lack of a name. It's a traveller. So what I'm trying to say, I guess, in a really convoluted way, is that perhaps Shelley, through the use of languages, through the use of this article a, not the traveller or a traveller I once knew, or I don't know, Shelley the traveller or John the traveller, perhaps what Shelley is trying to say through the use of this anonymity, through this anonymous language, is that names actually aren't that important. What Ozymandias believes, or what the Bible believes, or what, the story of the Tower of Babel is trying to tell us about names, isn't actually that important. Perhaps Shelley is saying that names and the association of identity with a name is not so important. What matters is the substance. What matters is who you are, not what kind of name you have or where you stand in society, but who you are inside. And I think this idea links very well with the fact that when we are introduced to Ozymandias' monument or statue, it's trunkless. Now, I mentioned this in the previous video, but the idea of having no trunk is essentially the idea of having no body. All that's left of Ozymandias is his head, really. His actual body is missing. His trunk is missing. It's less. Trunkless. And this adjective, I think, really shows, I'm going to add that it's an adjective here. This really shows that the substance is missing in Ozymandias, right? It's, I guess you could say, a metaphor. This adjective is a metaphor, which showcases that what actually matters is missing. He may be vast. His legacy may remain, I guess. His name may remain, but his body doesn't. He's dead, and even in his monument that's left behind, the trunk is missing. His body is missing. There's no body. I'm going to write that down. No body, which of course could also be nobody. There's nobody left. No body and nobody. And this, I think, really links with the idea of names and persona and power, because I think what Shelley is trying to say through language use is that a name is not that important. What matters is the body, the substance. And Ozymandias may have a name that's left behind, but his body is missing, his substance is missing, what matters is missing. And if you remember, also, Shelley was an atheist. So whatever kind of biblical ideas that everyone once had, Shelley didn't have those ideas. Shelley was an atheist. He was against God and Christianity, and he wouldn't have believed in the story of the Tower of Babel, and he wouldn't have really believed in the ideas associated with that story. So here's the second part of the poem that we're going to look into detail. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the first line. So we've got language such as sunk and shattered. So half sunk and shattered really give the idea that it's pretty broken, and we talked about this in the previous frame as well, that the statue, it hasn't lasted, it's not so durable, a lot of it is broken and a lot of pieces have fallen off. It's half sunk, but half of it pretty much remains. Again, this idea of trunklessness, that the trunk is missing, the body of it is missing, that's meant to say trunkless. This real semantic field of brokenness. And this brokenness, yes, it relates to the statue or the monument of Ozymandias, but it could also relate to broken ideas. For example, Ozymandias' ideas of lasting and creating a legacy and remaining forever and being strong forever is broken. Oopsie, I meant to underline, is broken. But also other ideas, which we talked about in our socio-historic video, Other themes and ideas are broken, such as the idea of power, of names, identity. Percy Shelley himself is kind of breaking and dismantling a lot within his poem, and it's not just to do with Ozymandias. You could actually say that the poem itself could be an extended metaphor of power itself. And so perhaps Shelley is breaking down ideas of power and legacy. So not just Ozymandias, but ideas around Ozymandias and what Ozymandias represents. So half sunk, shattered, that's an adjective. Visage or visage, which basically means face. So Ozymandias's face is half is shattered and half sunk. Whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. So again, this description, and we've got adjectives. Wrinkled, adjectives. We've got wrinkled, which suggests old age. Again, dismantling the idea of power and legacy. Old age associated with the adjective wrinkled really kind of maybe makes us think about Ozymandias as older. Maybe he's a bit more vulnerable. And of course, he's a bit more vulnerable because he ends up dying. Old age also reminds us of death. He has a wrinkled lip. But he's also frowning. The noun frown makes us think about Ozymandias is quite unpleasant. And then we've got this verb sneer, which really reinforces Ozymandias as unpleasant. So through this description of the half-sunken shattered visage, or visage, I think it's visage, we have this real illustration of Ozymandias' personality coming through. Remember, it's not Ozymandias himself, it's his half-sunk shattered face within the desert ruins. But through this kind of shattered face, we get an idea of his personality. And this is known as, of course, personification. When you have an object that's inanimate, personification. And you start to create a personality out of it. Of course, it's interesting that the power behind sneer, and even the adjective cold in cold command, there's sneer, cold, frown, creates a very kind of, powerful personality. Powerful personality. Ozymandias was, it seems weird to say, but he was a big personality, and that even shines through in the half-sunk and shattered visage. He may be half-sunk, it may be shattered, broken, but the personality still shines through. So, and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. Tell that its sculpture well those passions read. Now this is interesting because essentially what Shelley is saying is that the big personality, the powerful personality which shines through the sculpture is due to the artist, the sculptor. So the sculptor is the one who is truly talented because he was able to read the passions and recreate them on the sculpture of Ozymandias. So I'm just going to create a new slide here and talk in more detail about the theme of art and culture. So we've got this one quote, and it's about the sculptor, and it says that the sculptor has read Ozymandias' passions well. So Ozymandias was a passionate person, and the sculptor was able to recreate that. Now, in the socio-historic video, we talk a lot about Percy Shelley's beliefs, his belief in legacy, but not the legacy of person, not people's legacy and the things they leave behind, or power, or any of that stuff. No, he believes in the legacy of art and culture. So I believe that through that quote, Shelley is basically talking about how talented the sculptor is. The artist, the unnamed artist, and again, the importance of this, the artist is unnamed, but it's his artwork, or hers, most likely it was a man. It's his artwork which lasts. Now, this unnamed artist, who supposedly, according to, the times of Ozymandias, or even the times around in which Shelley was writing, supposedly having no name meant you really had no power. However, Shelley is giving this artist the power. He doesn't need a name. He's just an unnamed sculptor, and the noun sculptor is all that we have left of him to remember this sculptor by. But his artwork has lasted. It's lasted so long and so well that we can still read Ozymandias's passions. And by passions, Shelley is basically talking about Ozymandias's kind of big personality, which shows within the sculpture of him that's been left behind. Essentially, Shelley is removing the power away from Ozymandias and giving it to this unnamed sculptor. He is the true artist and the true reason why the poem Ozymandias remains. And remember, the poem Ozymandias is also a piece of art. Lastly, we've got the last two lines, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. And immediately what pops out is the oxymoron, survive and lifeless. That's oxymoronic language. And I think it's interesting that Shelley puts survive first. So, of course, what he's talking about is the passions which have lasted and can be read through the sculpture of Ozymandias' visage, or visage, I think it's visage, which yet survive. So the passions have survived. And remember, by passions, what we mean is essentially Ozymandias' cruel nature, which shows in his sneer, in his wrinkled lip, in his cold features. They have yet survived. So what survived is essentially the sculpture's creations or recreation of who Ozymandias was stamped, and this verb, this very active verb, present participle, stamped, is of course incredibly aggressive. And again, just this idea of poetry or art really recreating who a person was in their life, in their lifetime, in their prime, is really showcased by this verb stamped. So first of all, we've got the present tense of the verb, which I think is Shelley's way of showing how language recreates. Of course, through this very aggressive present tense verb stamped, we get this idea of how aggressive Ozymandias was back in his time. So he was an aggressive ruler, and this verb stamped really reminds us of how aggressive, I'm writing it here as well because why not, reminds us of how aggressive Ozymandias was through language. Shelley doesn't need to say Ozymandias was once aggressive. We don't need to be told that. He uses language, he uses this verb to showcase it instead of telling us. So again, the power of language and the power of how art, through this language, can display and outlast the person, how art can outlast people. And then, of course, back to the oxymoron, survive, stamped on these lifeless things. Now, again, a reminder that Ozymandias is dead, just in case you forgot. These things, and this is a noun, the noun things, really shows how inanimate the sculpture actually is. It's lifeless. Lifeless being an adjective, of course. So these things are lifeless, essentially. So just in case we forgot about the sculpture, just in case we forgot that Ozymandias was dead, we're reminded again through this this adjective lifeless, and we're reminded as well of the adjective trunkless, I think, too. And that adjective trunkless was present in the extract before. This idea of Ozymandias being gone is constantly sprinkled through the poem. Trunkless, lifeless. He's not there anymore. He's just a memory, and a memory preserved within poetry and within art. Lastly, we've got this little line here: the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. So the interpretation of this could be that Ozymandias mocked his subjects simply. So, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them. So the interpretation of this: Ozymandias was a very mocking ruler. He mocked his subjects. Perhaps he was dismissive of them, perhaps he was cruel to them. He was a cruel, cold, passionate, angry, wrinkled, half-sunk ruler. He wasn't a very nice guy, and that's quite obvious through the language that Shelley uses. He mocked his subjects. He looked down on them, and I think this really showcases through the sculptor. The sculptor isn't remembered. The sculptor's name isn't remembered. All that we remember is Ozymandias' name. And we've talked about how perhaps this is done on purpose to show how Shelley dismisses the importance of a name and adds more importance to the art, the legacy of artwork. But it could also be showing how cruel Ozymandias himself was, that he didn't give his sculptor a name, but his name is the one that lasts. So perhaps it could show the anonymity of the sculptor, could show how Ozymandias alone wanted to be remembered. No one else was allowed to be remembered. And perhaps the person that Ozymandias is mocking is the sculptor, who, it's his artwork, but he doesn't get to have a say, or he doesn't even get to leave behind his name. He's basically left abandoned, and he just basically is used as, I guess, a medium for Ozymandias to be remembered. But who actually is being mocked in the poem? We think about this verb mocked, and we think about who actually is being mocked in the poem. I guess Ozymandias is the one being mocked, and again we've got this ironic idea that even though Ozymandias was the mocking and cruel ruler, he is the one who ends up being mocked through this poem. Continuously, Shelley shows how everything that Ozymandias wants, a legacy, to be remembered, it's undermined consistently throughout the poem. So we've got the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. Again, a lot of people believe that because this line is quite confusing, that there's been different interpretations. But the one that I like the best is this idea that Ozymandias mocked his subjects. Perhaps the hand that mocked them could show how he was quite a greedy ruler. His hand would always come in between his subjects and their, food, livelihood, happiness, anything you want to think about. Perhaps his hand would come in between and take away whatever his subjects needed at the time, and he would mock his subjects through accumulating all the power, through accumulating all the wealth. And remember, we talk a lot about how Shelley believed in equality, and Ozymandias, of course, was a very unequal ruler. He wanted all the power, he wanted all the legacy, he wanted to be the one to be remembered, and I think this line could highlight that. And the heart that fed could perhaps show that Ozymandias genuinely, was satisfied through mocking his subjects. That's what fed his heart, that's what he enjoyed the most. At the end of the day, he was someone who enjoyed taking away and mocking and removing and essentially just being cruel towards his subjects. And that's what fed his heart. He really had no substance. I think this is interesting as well because right above heart, if you can see, I've kind of unfortunately covered it up with red, but we've got lifeless. So even visually, we've got these two words kind of stamped on top of each other, lifeless and heart. And I think that's done on purpose. I think that really shows how Ozymandias' heart is almost shown to be lifeless. He doesn't really have a heart. I want to talk about these two lines, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, because I do feel like they have a bit of an alternate meaning as well. And this meaning is a bit of a stronger meaning than the one before, which is why I've separated these two lines. So this meaning really reflects on the theme of art and culture. So previously we were talking about Ozymandias' lifeless features stamped on the sculpture before this line, and now we've got the hand that mocked them. Now this hand could refer, and most probably refers, to the sculptor's hand. So before, we implied that the hand was Ozymandias's and he was mocking his subjects. That could well be a good interpretation, but a deeper one, a more meaningful one, could be that the hand that is mocking these lifeless things that are stamped on the sculpture could be the sculptor's very hand. This makes more sense when we look at the verb mocked. Now, this verb actually has a deeper meaning. It doesn't just mean to make fun of or to laugh at. It also means to imitate. And in Shelley's time, the verb to mock would have had this dual meaning. It would have meant both to laugh at, to imitate in order to reduce into something laughable, but it also just simply meant to imitate. So can you see how this line could have a deeper meaning when we see the verb mocked as something a lot different? It could simply just mean to recreate or to imitate. So the hand, sculptor's hand, that mocked, as in that imitated Ozymandias' features and Ozymandias' passions and his cruelty into the form of a sculpture, into something inanimate and lifeless. Does that make sense? So essentially the hand, this article the, which is a definite article, by the way, and that basically means that this article, which is the, which links to the noun hand, it has a definite person behind it. It's the sculptor. So we definitely know whose hand it is, essentially. It's the hand. It's not a hand. It's not a random anonymous hand like a traveller. It's definitely the sculptor's. So this reinforces this argument. And when we look at the heart that fed, this heart could be Ozymandias's. His cruel heart, his lifeless heart, his heart full of anger and passions, which, in a way, have fed the sculptor. So this verb fed really highlights how art, or how Shelley believes art works. That Ozymandias has a heart, a cruel heart, which is cemented by the lines beforehand, which imply that Ozymandias is full of passions, he's cold, he's sneering, he has a cruel heart, which feeds the sculptor and allows him to create and mock a real life piece of art. So to stamp reality and passions and emotions onto a lifeless piece of art takes a lot of talent. And what Shelley is basically saying is that it's the sculptor's hand who is responsible for that. The hand that mocked them, this idea of definite articles and indefinite articles might confuse you a bit. So I'm just going to illustrate the difference. So the is what's known as a definite article, which means that there's a definite person behind the noun it's attached to. And just, there's definitely a person, you know, it's not a, it's the hand. So it's more important almost when there's a definite article, when there's a the involved. The noun that article is attached to, in this case the hand is the noun, is more important. It's more almost definitive or singled out. You know who it is. Now this is interesting because the use of this definite article can be used for both Ozymandias. In some interpretations, you could say that Ozymandias is the hand who overruled and mocked them, his subjects. That's meant to say subject. Or you could say, as we talked about in the previous frame, that the could be the sculptor who mocked, imitated, or even perhaps imitated in order to laugh at. Perhaps Ozymandias is the subject that's being laughed at through this mockery, but definitely there's imitation going on, and them could be not Ozymandias, but the lifeless objects that Ozymandias has left behind as a testament to his legacy. But just really quickly, if the is a definite article, then a is an indefinite article, and a makes the noun that this indefinite article is attached to a lot more anonymous. And remember, at the beginning of the poem, we're introduced to a traveller, so the noun traveller becomes a lot more anonymous. It's not the traveller, it's a traveller, some random traveller who's rendered anonymous simply by the use of an indefinite article. So that's just an interesting point which you could definitely use in your exam and essay. Okay, so now we're going to look at the next 3 lines, and I've already circled and for you, so let's focus on the beginning line first of all, even though I know there's something up here. We're going to get to that later on. So I've circled and because these first 3 lines begin with a coordinating conjunction. That's what and is. Basically links 2 sentences together. So the first thing we're going to think about is why Shelley would begin this new line with and. What is the reason? He could have started it with simply on the pedestal these words appear, but there's this idea of and, this conjunction, which links the bit before to the bit that comes now, which gives a sense of continuation. And this idea of continuation associated with the coordinating conjunction and could perhaps be a little reminder about the theme of time. It could remind you of the idea of Ozymandias' legacy continuing. Perhaps this and is a reminder of Ozymandias' desire to carry on his legacy. So every single word used is very important. That's meant to say legacy, by the way. Every single word used is very important, and we can delve into the use of and a lot more, but I think the most simplest and reasonable explanation is that and is used purposefully to connect and give us a sense of legacy. It gives us a sense of continuing, it gives us a sense of flow, and that's exactly what Ozymandias wants. He wants a continuation, he wants to essentially last forever. Anyway, continuing on, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Now, I've highlighted King of Kings because this is a direct quote, King of Kings, from the Bible. So it actually, King of Kings doesn't just show up once, it shows up more than a couple of times, a few times in the Bible, and always in reference to Jesus or God. There's also Lord of Lords, which is used a lot in the Bible. So this idea of King of Kings, Lord of Lords, being the highest. He's not just a king, he's the King of Kings. He rules kings. Attaching this to Ozymandias, and remember, this is Ozymandias' own words. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. This is what's written on the pedestal. These are words that Ozymandias has inscribed himself or ordered to be inscribed himself. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Biblical language is used. And Shelley does this on purpose. He does this, I think, in order to really highlight Ozymandias' arrogance, making it incredibly ironic that all that's left of him is lifeless artifacts. The fact that on the pedestal Ozymandias' own words have appeared and it's my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, really kind of cements this idea that Ozymandias wanted to last forever. Again, we've got and. He wanted to have his legacy remain forever, even to the point where the sculptures weren't cutting it. He had to write his own kind of message to people. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, a biblical message which renders him exactly like God, I guess. He's a Jesus figure, he's a God figure. And remember, quickly, just as an aside, what Shelley thought of God and the Bible. He didn't believe in it. Shelley was an atheist, remember? Also, if you have watched the socio-historic video and watched the previous frames as well, we do talk a lot about the Tower of Babel. And remember, the story of the Tower of Babel was human beings who wanted to climb to heaven and become exactly like God. It's a biblical story about the dangers of thinking you're so arrogant that you're exactly like God. And this is what Ozymandias believed. And this is why I think Shelley has used this biblical language to really highlight how Ozymandias is also just like the people who wanted to climb to heaven and become like God, how Ozymandias is that arrogant and eventually ends up being punished for it, just like the people in the Tower of Babel were punished by being scattered into different lands and not being able to have a name for himself. In the same way, Ozymandias, wanting to be the King of Kings, wanting to be exactly like God, ends up scattered in the same way, ends up losing his name. And we can also tell that Ozymandias' name and identity is really important, because we've got this little quote here: my name is Ozymandias, right? This identity that he just keeps reinforcing, even through language and through the use of his name. His identity is his name. And from this identity, he gets power. He gets a sense of strength. He gets a sense of legacy. His name is Ozymandias. Look at the present tense as well. It's ongoing. It's continuous. It's still happening in his mind. But that arrogance is really, really cemented through this line. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Okay, and the last line, we've got, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. And this last line is incredibly important because A, we've already reinforced that A, this is Ozymandias speaking, according to Shelley, of course, and B, or two, it showcases his arrogance and desires. However, although it is Ozymandias speaking, because Shelley has written the poem and we can understand that perhaps Shelley is making a point about power and legacy and essentially how weak everything is in comparison to what really matters: nature, art and culture. Mankind always loses in the face of nature and art and culture. So we've got, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Now, we're going to take it as Ozymandias speaking because this is what is written on his pedestal. We're going to take it as a reflection of Ozymandias' arrogance and desires, his need for legacy. But we're also going to take it as an incredibly ironic and mocking quote written specifically by Shelley in order to really reflect on Ozymandias' failed desires and his failed legacy, essentially. So we've got, look on my works. So here he is using an imperative. An imperative is essentially a commanding sentence. So look at this, or focus on this. Yeah, so he's using an imperative. He's saying, look on my works. And he's saying despair. Now this verb, despair, yes, it could signal that Ozymandias wants anyone who looks on his work to feel despair, to feel hopeless, to feel overpowered. He wants anyone who looks on his works, his mighty works, and feel despair, feel sadness. The last three lines of this, nothing besides remains, caesura, which is a pause in the line. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch away. The first thing we can note is that this pronoun nothing really emphasizes, well, nothing. There's nothing there. There's no legacy. There's nothing left behind. And I think this could either be ironic if you're looking at the lines before, as Ozymandias's words, immediately we're gone from despair on my works, look on my works, look at how great I am, to nothing besides remains. So you could say that this is incredibly ironic and mocking of Ozymandias's beliefs and believing that he could have a legacy in the first place. Or you could say that this just essentially highlights what the sculptor believes, that Ozymandias is deluded, and essentially the sculptor slash Shelley believes actually that Ozymandias is deluded. And if you believe that throughout the whole poem there's this kind of mockery and ironic tone, you can say that this nothing really simply cements that and establishes the fact that the whole poem is ironic in the first place. So you've got nothing besides remains round the decay, and immediately what pops out are these two nouns. Both of these have the lexical field or semantic field of death. We've got remains and we've got decay, this idea of someone's remains being left or decaying, a decaying body. We've also got lone, level, wreck, boundless, bare, again, a real lexical or semantic field of emptiness, which could of course link with the idea of death. So there's no sense of continuation, there's no sense of legacy continuing, there's no kind of circular emphasis on carrying on and living forever. There's just emptiness, death. And this is really, really established by the language that Shelley uses. We've also got a lot of language which links to emptiness that lasts for a long time, or something that's big or something that's huge. And I think this really links with the beginning of the poem as well, where we think about how everything is big, things are empty. There's a vast sense of emptiness. It's in a desert, remember? It's in an antique land. So we imagine this long stretch of desert, this huge wreck in the middle of nowhere. There's really no civilization to be found. It's literally just a long, huge stretch of desert in some foreign antique land. And let me write the word foreign, because I think that's quite important, that the British reader, who probably has never even been out of England or Britain, would be reading this poem just simply imagining a desert. They would have never come anywhere close to this part of the world, which of course must be Egypt and on a desert somewhere. So this idea of foreignness is really established when we think about the typical reader of Shelley's time as well. And I think Shelley really plays up to this idea of foreignness, of Ozymandias being so antique, not just old, not just from centuries ago, but also distant from everyone else in this big, vast, absolutely empty stretch of land which just goes on forever and ever. It would be impossible to find Ozymandias' statue if it weren't for this traveller, who, remember, is still narrating the story. If it weren't for this random anonymous, and even the traveller, remember, is just a traveller who's anonymous. He's referred to by an indefinite article, which means he's just literally some random guy. If it weren't for him coming across the speaker, we would never know about Ozymandias in the first place. So again, this idea of distance, foreignness, which I've already written, but I'll write again, because why not? I've got a big board to write on. Distance and foreignness and just emptiness as well. Things are missing, there's nothing which remains. And I think this could link very well to, I know I keep going on about it, but trunkless, lifeless. Throughout the whole poem, Shelley is really using language to establish, the lack of things. Ozymandias has a lack of a legacy, but also his remains haven't left anything behind. All that's left behind is one shattered visage and a poem to remember Ozymandias by, and that's it. If we're going to quickly just look at some of the language that Shelley uses, the language devices in particular, as well in the last three lines, there's a huge amount of emphasis on tone. So we've got colossal, less, lone, and level, and that is known as assonance. Assonance is when there are a whole load of similar sounding sounds, I guess you could call it. Colossal, boundless, bare, lone, level. We've got a lot of assonance. It's any sound, any consonant sound which has a similar vibe to it, similar sound to it, which matches. That's what's known as assonance. And of course we've got sibilants. Sans, stretch, and also that sound in colossal and boundless, which really links with a hissing sound. So again, this very kind of, I don't want to call it negative, but almost kind of hostile sound, and especially right at the end, stretch, sans, stretch, less, colossal, and of course I keep going on about it, I cannot apologise enough, but trunkless, that sound in trunkless, and lifeless. Again, this sibilant sound, this idea of hissing or snake-like hostility, which, yeah, again, like, it's hostile. It's like booing Ozymandias throughout. When you hiss, you're essentially booing someone or getting them off the stage, and so the sibilance is incredibly important in terms of the tone of the poem.